if you want to get into a setting, a world, a creative way of viewing the past, then literature is the way to do it. Trying to make something accessible is really important, so it's sort of like no fear Shakespeare, bits and pieces, to make Shakespeare accessible.
Okay, welcome back everybody to the 49th episode of the My Generation podcast. My name is Max, and on today's show we're going to be talking about English literature with English literature student Alexa Barrett, who is also my sister, and we've got her on the show. Welcome to the show.
Hello, I'm glad to be here.
Thank you very much for coming on. Just to also tease a few things coming up through the show. As you know, we've got music now on the show. We have got local Kent artists, The Goods Gone. They're going to be on the show with 2 songs later. We're going to be playing their song Bad Name first. That'll be coming on a little later in the show, so please stay tuned for that. And obviously we've got local Kent music enthusiast Sammy Bacon, who'll be also coming on to talk about an album recommendation for the week. All that to come on the My Generation podcast. But first, to Alexa, we're talking English literature. So firstly, I'd like just to ask where your sort of desire to study English literature first arose.
Well, it's kind of interesting. I used to always think that English literature was literally about learning what a pronoun or a noun was, and that it was literally just about the background to writing and the architecture behind writing a newsletter or something like that. And there was bits and bobs of creative writing which always caught my eye, but English literature itself was something I only came across when I was probably about 12, and I read the novel Holes by Louis Sachar in my first secondary school, and I suddenly went to my teacher, wait a second, so we study books in English, so we don't just learn about letters and spelling and doing spelling tests. And I was like, wait a second, this is really cool. I didn't realise we studied books. And then he showed me how to write an essay, and I was so confused. I was like, this doesn't make sense. This isn't what I thought English was. I thought English was just the basics, like maths. I'm saying that maths is basic. Obviously there's another level to maths, but at the time I saw maths as just adding practically, and I saw English as writing practically. And it was this new way of critiquing novels, and it was very weird, because at first I thought, oh, I don't like this. I don't like writing essays at all. It's awful, and I don't like the books that I'm studying. But then I started to study The Woman in Black by Susan Hill, and it sort of started to change from there, where I was like, wait, you can explore a novel and its ideas creatively, because it is creative, and then, you know, you can learn from there.
Well, what's the sort of creative side to exploring a novel then? As I imagine many listeners might be thinking, an essay writing, whilst you're sort of conjuring up your own ideas about the thing, the creativity comes from the novel, but what's the creative aspect of analysis for you?
Yeah, a lot of people think that the creativity comes from the novel, and of course, yes, you have to create the world, but if there's nobody, I mean, I'm talking like novels written specifically for this purpose. There are some novels written, e.g. just for entertainment purposes or for informational purposes. I'm talking about, you know, your 1984 George Orwell or your Charles Dickens, things like that. And they are written for somebody, in my opinion, to come along and take that world and creatively deconstruct it in an academic way. So academics is creative because it is that next level to the creativity you've been given, and I think it takes an extra level of creativity because you need to know what to do with the creativity you've been given by the author. So say they've created a specific world, you can then go back and analyse how that world was created in comparison, a Charles Dickens style place in comparison to something in the 16th century and how they created setting. And that creativity comes from, I'd say, I prefer the setting, character, narrative theory. That's where it thrives for me. However, there's a lot of creativity in new lenses coming out, like feminist lens and Marxist lens and things like that, that I'm trying to learn about and explore. But for me, it stems from narrative theory that I really get creative.
Yeah, and what's at the moment? What are some of the novels that you're really enjoying deconstructing, and why?
I don't formally deconstruct every novel I've done. So it's when I'm reading them now that I read them in this creative breaking down fashion. So I'd say, yes, there are ones that I have done for assignments and bits and pieces that I have absolutely loved. However, the ones that I've not formally deconstructed are probably the ones that I'd rather talk about, because they're the ones I've just explored. So my favourite novel, The Sea by Iris Murdoch, that was an amazing one to really get in the head of the character and learn about. So then I think to create the world of the character, you have to read other books by that author. So it's my favourite book, because I also read The Unicorn by that author, The Sandcastle.
And what is it about that book specifically that you enjoy so much?
It's a really long book talking about a man falling in love in a very unconventional way, with somebody that he used to be with, who's now married, and it's kind of like a crime because he's breaking the law to fall in love with her. There's some tragedy. It's just got all the elements, and it's so creative, and it's one of Iris Murdoch's best, I think, because unlike The Black Prince, which is her only other novel that I've read that's in first person, I could really sort of get behind this guy and be like, although what you're doing is absolutely awful, I really am rooting for you, and I don't know why. And that psychological confusion is quite an art.
It seems like quite a period piece as well. So this is whenabouts is this story set?
Oh, that's a good question. You're testing me now. I think Iris Murdoch wrote in the 1900s. But she, like many authors, my favourite authors, doesn't set a time period. It's why they're timeless.
Yeah, I was going to sort of ask that about why would we be reading novels from the past in the modern day? What would you say to people who maybe are sort of sceptical about English literature's place in modern society, and why reading older novels is so important?
Oh, it is just so important. I mean, do you know the phrase Big Brother?
Yes.
And when I'd say all big brothers listening to us, do you know what I mean for that?
No.
So the root of that comes from George Orwell's 1984. It's in the past. Obviously, it was written a year before his death, just after World War II, I think. And that would class as a historical novel. And if we didn't have that novel is so key to politics now. It changes your perception of politics. It makes you go, is someone watching me while I read this? Am I safe? And that's timeless. I read it in 2019, 2018 maybe, and I still felt that same, is somebody watching me read this, and they know I'm an insider and all this thing. That's timeless. You can learn so much. And like what other novels? So Jane Eyre, another excellent novel written by Charlotte Bronte, I think in 1849, if I'm correct. Please don't fact check this. And she was writing under a male name. Yeah, all the things she was saying about women, sort of women being equal, women having a voice, and is still rooted at the basics of feminism today. And why would we discount minds from the past?
Yeah, so it's sort of not only just a reflection of that time period, but also carries a lot of truths through to today. So it's interesting what you say about in the past, that perspective of the past. Do you think literature is sort of a basically the gateway into our view of the past?
I think you can look at the past in lots of different ways. So I've studied philosophy and history as well, and there are other gateways into the past. I think there's lots. There's scientific gateways, of course. I just think if you want to get into a setting, a world, a creative way of viewing the past, then literature is the way to do it. It's just the way that I found quite interesting to connect, but I think you need every avenue. So like, to connect to the Greeks, you need your philosophy, your Aristotle, bits and pieces like that. So as long as you combine all the different avenues and use the ones you need, you can create a fuller picture of the past.
And when that relates to your own work, a lot of writers read heavily. Are you a writer as well as a heavy reader? And
I don't know if I call myself a writer, but I write. Yes, I love writing. But I find the tricky thing for me is I've read so many great books, so many absolutely stunning pieces of literature, that I'll write something now and I'll think, well, it's not exactly Orwell, so so that makes it harder. But I'm grateful that I've been able to be influenced by so many.
Yeah, do you feel like you sort of soak up all of that and it goes into your writing? It sort of gets weaved into what you're producing?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, from a young age, when I was a girl, I used to read Mallory Towers, and I noticed whenever I put the book down from reading Mallory Towers, my next little novella that I was going to go into, or novel, as I wanted it to be, would always be about a little girl in boarding school and things like that. So yes, it does, and it still does today. So I was reading Frankenstein. I mean, Mary Shelley is just a work of art. Like, her writing is just beautiful. And I try to capture some of her ideas when I go through. Sometimes I highlight if I'm particularly impressed. And of course, that book is riddled with being impressed at every different line. So I did take some of those ideas, because that's what writing's about. It's inspired by others, and try to incorporate that into my own writing. But I tell you what, it's hard. It's very hard.
Yeah. So, and looking into what you sort of want to do with this sort of back catalogue of work you've done, what do you feel like are your next steps in terms of English literature? Because translating it into sort of written work and how people could consume it, what do you think that step is?
I don't know. I'm still exploring the world of literature. And I think that's the thing with it. There's so many different places to go, different routes. I think the best way to do it is trying to make something accessible is really important. So it's sort of like No Fear Shakespeare, bits and pieces, to make Shakespeare accessible. Yeah. However, I think now that I'm into the world, I'm also able to go to the less accessible bits and pieces, like the critics and the people that are really invested in it. So I'm still trying to work out where I fit, where I want to be in the accessibility, where I'm teaching others how to explore ideas, which I'm interested in, and also getting to the root of really difficult stuff, really difficult thoughts and ideas that are not necessarily as accessible, that I need to spend a bit longer learning about.
Yeah, well, you sort of start with the surface stuff and you work your way through. I imagine you're drilling through all these at quite a rate. When it comes to reading, I imagine in taking in all this information, there's quite a lot to take in. So how many books are you reading and how frequently are you reading them?
This is just a ballpark. I aimed to read a book a week, which I attempted, and depending obviously on length of book, sometimes it would take 2 weeks, 3 weeks if I wasn't really into the book, or I had exams on. But that's what I aimed for. Sometimes I'd read a book in 2 days because it's amazing. But I always try and get with a new book that I'm reading, on the first night I'm reading it, 25 pages in, because as soon as you get 25 pages in, you have a good idea of what the book has to offer. I'm not saying it reveals all of it, but you get a taste of it, and I think those first 25 pages need to be read on the first day so that you go, yes, I want to come back to this. So I do try and keep up with 25 pages, then the next day another 25 to 50 pages, and you keep that pace up, and generally you can get through, I think in the last year or two I've got through like 50 books, but I'm not sure, I can't keep track.
So many books. Well, we're going to keep this conversation going. I'm just got to punt a few more things we've got happening on the show at the moment. Just wanted to let everyone listening know that we are available for this show on both YouTube and SoundCloud. So whatever platform you're listening on, SoundCloud's fairly new to the My Generation podcast, so definitely follow us on SoundCloud as well, so that you can take in the podcast content on there if you'd like to take it in on that platform as well. Now to Sammy Bacon. Sammy is a music enthusiast based in Canterbury, and every week he brings us a 1-minute quick-fire album recommendation to get your teeth into. Here's what Sammy recommends this week.
Hi guys, Sammy Bacon here to give you another album recommendation. This week I'm going to be recommending Ezra Furman's Perpetual Motion People. Ezra Furman is a indie rock singer-songwriter from America, and Perpetual Motion People is the perfect starter album to what is one of my favourite artists. I first heard about Ezra Furman when I was 18. For my 18th birthday, my friend Lloyd bought me the CD, Perpetual Motion People, and I fell in love with it. It's an album that talks about gender and identity and masculinity and femininity, and it is, as I've said already, it is a fantastic starter album into one of the most interesting singer-songwriters of our generation. Ezra Furman brings this really interesting kind of collide of rockabilly, indie rock, singer-songwriter, jazz rock, and doo-wop, kind of. It has amazing tracks on it, such as Haunted Head, Lousy Connection, and Restless Year. While I don't think it's as good as some of his other things, such as Transangelic Exodus or Day of the Dog, I think if you want to get into Ezra Furman, this is where you start. If you like this, you should like his other stuff. So yeah, Ezra Furman, Perpetual Motion People, give it a listen. Hope you like it. See you next time.
Thank you for that, Sammy. We will tune in with Sammy again next week to find out what the next album he recommends that you listen to is. And we're going to be going back to Alexa in just a moment. But first, I wanted to introduce the band that we're going to be playing on the show. They're called The Good's Gone. They are a local Kent band. They've done the Seaside Sessions in Margate. But gigging-wise, they've been playing quite a lot in Deal and Medway and in Ramsgate as well. But over the last year, they've been concentrating on recording for their EP. And throughout 2020, they're going to be travelling as much as they can, and hopefully they are travelling all over Europe. They've told me they'll be visiting Switzerland and Germany, doing gigs all over the place, and further up north through England. Really, really great stuff, and really honoured to feature them on today's episode of the podcast. So we'll be playing two of their songs. Opening firstly here, right now, on the My Generation podcast, The Good's Gone. Here's their song titled Bad Name.
Something
That's The Goods Gone and their song Bad Name. We'll be having their other song on later on in the show, so definitely keep on listening for that. We're going back to Alexa now. I just wanted to ask you, you've said about your favourite book. What would you say have been some of the most, more personally, what have been your favourite books you'd recommend for people to listen to in and around the sort of young people age bracket?
Generally what I read are things like vintage classics, and I don't know if that's what the younger generation are into, but some absolutely timeless ones. They apply to any age, but I guess to younger people as well. They're really key to getting a good idea of the world. The first one would probably be On the Beach by Neville Shute. I hope I pronounced that right. The book, without any spoilers, is essentially about people caught up in a nuclear war, but he decides not to focus on the politics of it. That's the beauty of it. He goes, this has happened, let's accept it. How do these people cope with it? And it's set in Australia, and it's the last people alive after this, and they think in the future that they will not be alive due to the human race being wiped out by it. And it's just such a heartfelt book. Like, the good books are ones that you can cry at, so that's probably the first one.
And do you think books, you get quite emotional when you read as well?
Oh yes, yeah. This is something that I didn't used to do until I started reading the proper hard hitting classics, and I can easily cry at an ending of a book now. Really, it's quite hard not to in some of them. I mean, definitely read that book, and then you will see what I mean when you get to the end of it.
Well, I think it's quite easy to feel that through something like the medium of film. Because you're seeing it all happen in front of you, and you might be in a theatre, so all the lights are off and all the atmosphere's pointing you just at the screen. What do you think allows you to sort of achieve that same level of immersion with a book? Are there any things you do when setting up to read that sort of keep you in the world? As it's sort of difficult in the modern age, I think, with everything being so fast.
I think the secret to a good writer is somebody who can keep you in that world. So hopefully a lot of that job is done for you, so that when you pick up the book, you are put into it. And it's not necessarily about, putting yourself in a book corner and really setting yourself up. Yes, I'm going to read now. For 10 minutes when I'm waiting for something in the post office, maybe I'll just sit down and read 2 pages or something. It's not about the environment. I think film is very visual, the environment you're in. The difference with a book is you're invested for a long time, because it takes a long time to read some books, in a particular character, and you mainly pick up the plot. And when you're invested in that character, whether you come back to them for 10 minutes at the end of a long day, or for 2 hours when you've sat down and you're like, yes, I'm going to read, you will come back to that character and just be back in that world. You will be with them, and that's a sign of a good book. Like with Frankenstein, I'd come back at the end of the day, I'd sit down, and yeah, there Frankenstein was, back in the world, back in the dark, dingy streets, fearing for his life, fearing for his family, and you go straight back into that. I don't know, there's no real trick to it. You can try different methods, different things work for different people, but for me, I just find it quite easy.
Yeah, to sort of slip into that world. And would you say it's quite important to always have a book on you?
I take a book or 2 everywhere with me, literally everywhere. It's why I read books that are lighter. If I can get a book that's a paperback, I will be like, yes, brilliant, because I can take a book with me at all times, because you never know when you're gonna have time to read. So like the other day, I just nipped out of the house and I was like, oh, I'm just going to meet a friend for a coffee, so I don't have time to read. And I left my book at home, and I got to the coffee shop and she was running 20 minutes late. And I was like, no, I could have read for 20 minutes. That is a wasted opportunity. So take a book with you all the time.
Yeah, no matter what the book is. I mean,
yes.
So you're in sort of more of a fiction world. Does this ever sort of bleed into non-fiction or biography?
Let me have a think. I think the first non-fiction thing I ever read was a space novel. which was lots and lots of facts about space, and I really enjoyed that because it was science-based. And I never really saw that as reading. I always saw that as more learning. But as I grew older, I sort of realised non-fiction does bleed into it. So probably the only stuff that I've read that's non-fiction would be Down and Out in Paris and London, George Orwell's backstory.
Well, it's you get sort of an idea of behind the author then, don't you, with that?
Yes.
Do you think the life of the author or the authors you're reading is almost just as interesting as the novel itself?
Yeah, because then you get an idea of why they keep repeating ideas and stuff. Like, I read George Orwell's Why I Write, and Down and Out in Paris and London book was just a heartfelt, wow, this is what this guy went through. This is why he feels this way. And you can read all of his books. So like, you don't care about politics anymore. You just care about where it's come from. And the book is about his experience on the streets in Paris and London. And you learn so much about his character and where he came from. It's beautiful.
Yeah, I sort of get that same feeling when I'm doing film work. I like to look at what the director's doing. I guess the difference with film is that it's got a larger team, so you've got so many different people's opinions coming into it, whereas I imagine most of the classics were sort of written by all one person from beginning to end.
Well, yeah, it sort of, but no writer writes in isolation. So the non-fiction Down and Out in Paris and London has tons of other people influencing his life. That he wouldn't be able to write it if he hadn't have had the people there that shaped that, and you get that as well with fiction. So Jane Eyre didn't get written in seclusion, of course. It was influenced by Bronte's need to make money to support herself, influenced by other people's opinions, and without that it wouldn't have worked.
Lovely. Well, we're going to be continuing the conversation with Alexa about English literature, but that's what we've had to say so far. Do you have a story to tell about the subject, though? If so, feel free to leave us a comment here on YouTube or on Soundcloud. You can also get in touch with the Facebook page at the My Generation Podcast, and we can feature your comments on future episodes of the show. So please do leave your comments down below, and we'll feature them, maybe bring some of them to Alexa and have her back on the podcast to react to some of your comments if you like. And also remember that we're going to be featuring The Goods Gone, the musicians from Kent. They're going to be featuring their second song slightly later on in the show, so do keep listening for that. But we're moving on to the local impact now. So what do you think, if there's someone who's interested in English literature and they're living in the county of Kent, that they can do to get involved?
There's lots of opportunities available, like working in bookstores, doing competitions and bits and pieces, but I think what I'd mainly recommend is, as a young person, get out there and talk to other people that are booky and into books, and bond with people over books. There are plenty of us out there, especially in Kent. I've met loads of people who have come to me and said, oh, have you read this book? And I can chat to them for hours, because that's the thing about books is, and I think it's the same for film as well, like you just get it. You know what you're both talking about, because you have, it's almost like a mutual friend. You know when you have a mutual friend and you then suddenly have memories that connect you two together and you can bond better. Well, speaking to other people in the local community about books, maybe by going to book events, which host at bookshops, by just speak to people really, and say, oh, have you read this book? Maybe it's a bestseller that's current, maybe it's a really good classic, and hopefully then you will have that mutual friend character to speak about.
Yeah, and do you think that there are sort of almost like networking opportunities for people in Kent? So I imagine that's sort of something you can do almost anywhere, isn't it? Oh
yeah, definitely, yeah. You're going to find people into books everywhere across the world, you know. I was in a cafe up in Scarborough once, and it changed my life because I was speaking to the man behind the counter, and he started to tell me how, I think, as far as I can remember, he was an English teacher and it had taken him across the world. And so he said education is key, and it's the same for every subject really. As soon as you have a passion, you can bond with people anywhere.
Yeah, so did he just see you reading a book or had a book on you and you just got talking?
No, it was just a local cafe and it was a hot day, and I just said to him, like, how's your day been? What have you been up to? And he said, he just got interested and said, what are you studying? And it just led on from there. So the key to it is just talk to people, and they are really interesting. Yeah,
people you know, people you don't know, because I'm sure there's probably people within your life that probably are massive bookworms that you wouldn't maybe even necessarily expect to.
Yeah. What
have been some of the best conversations you've had about books?
Let me have a think. It's mainly like I met a young girl who's about my age, and over the last few months we've just been chatting over the phone about different books we've read, and it really resonated with me because it was kind of like we'd read the same childhood books, and it felt like, although we didn't know each other when we were from different walks of life and from different areas and all these different things, that because we were suddenly chatting about Hetty Feather by Jacqueline Wilson and how much we loved that as children, that suddenly we were like, wait a second, maybe we could be really good friends here. And she was just sort of joking, like, yeah, we definitely need to have more book discussions, and it sort of carried on from there.
Yeah, I mean, you end up teaching people as well, don't you?
Yes, yeah, you got to educate people on. I think that's another passion. I love to teach people about what I know from literature, because there's no point in being isolated when you've got a passion and you love something.
And so is teaching like a next step for you?
I hope so. Yeah, that's what I want to go into, because constantly if people will come to me and be like, "Oh, do you know anything about this piece of work?" and I can give them a hand with an essay or something like that. I'm constantly wanting to help in the best way I can. So it comes hand in hand with English. English is an educational subject. You educate people through literature, and then you take that literature and educate others. And
what's the next book on your horizon?
Oh, at the minute I'm reading A Town Like Alice by Neville Shute as well. Again, he's back. And it's so far really interesting. I'm just trying to get my head around it. It's very sad, like his other book, but it's something I haven't read. I haven't read anything similar to it because it's set in a completely different country, and it's set in a war that I know absolutely nothing about. And then after that, I'm hoping to read something more Jane Eyre-like, something Victorian girl-like.
Yeah, well, by the time that this episode comes out, because we pre-record these a little bit in advance, these episodes, you probably already read both of those books, and we'll be able to give some maybe ideas on the Facebook page as to what you've thought of those if people are interested. Well, we're just going to tease the next couple of topics we've got coming up on the show. So in January on the My Generation podcast, on the 23rd, I believe, we featured local Kent artist Renegade from Whitstable, talking about the music creating process. And we're going to be featuring very soon on the podcast a band called Off Topic. They're going to be coming on the show to have a similar discussion about their band's music creating process. And we're also going to be having Dan Inwood back on the podcast for the 1 year anniversary of the My Generation podcast. We've almost made it to a year of episodes, which is just absolutely crazy to me. I mean, this episode here is going to be number 49. We are 3 away from the magic 1 year mark of the podcast. And I just wanted to thank you all so much for listening to the amount of episodes that we've had coming out, and we're very nearly at 1 year. We're going to be going back to Alexa in just a moment to wrap up this week's episode of the My Generation podcast. But there are future topics we're looking for people to still talk about. I again want to talk sport. So is there a sport you're really keen to talk about? Maybe you've come up through the lower leagues of football, or you just play as a hobby. Maybe you do badminton like I do with Joe Toomey, who we had on for the 3rd episode of the podcast. Or maybe it's a sport we haven't even mentioned. You can get in touch with the Facebook page at the My Generation podcast. Over there we also post questions and feature answers on future episodes of the show. So definitely click like on the Facebook page so you can get in touch with the show and actually get what you want said across. And we're going to be asking Alexa one more question in just a moment. But first I want to head back to The Goods Gone. They're the local Kent artists who mainly do gigging in the Deal and Medway areas and have been focusing on recording a lot for their EP over the last year. They're touring across Europe and the north of England. And we're going to be playing another one of their songs here on the My Generation podcast. So here's The Goods Gone, In the Middle of the Night. And that was our second song from The Goods Gone, In the Middle of the Night, here on the My Generation podcast. Really, really excited to feature their music. Absolutely great stuff. We're going to be having them on the show again soon with some more songs from their EP. And looking forward to more that this great local Kent band bring to us. Thank you so much for coming on the show. Now, my last question to Alexa, English literature. We are talking. I just wanted to ask what you've learned by talking about English literature here today on the My Generation podcast.
I've probably learned that I know more than I thought I knew. I sort of just see it like a hobby that I get to do, which is brilliant because I really enjoy it. And to sit down and talk about it, I'm like, wait a second, I actually do know my stuff. I have read more than I thought I did, but I definitely also think that it's made it more apparent to me that I need to spread the word that reading is not just what you were forced to do when you were 4 years old or 10 years old or for your GCSEs. Reading is a friend for life, so I definitely do it.
Yeah, well, can we get you back on the show?
Yes, of course.
So we'll have to talk more in depth.
Everyone wants me.
Yeah, more in depth about English literature. I am absolutely sure of that, as it's a subject that I feel it's one of the oldest, isn't it? It's been around.
It's a universal subject. It's like philosophy. Like you just need it. Without it, what do we have?
And I mean, English literature must have been around. Well, it's one of the oldest mediums of storytelling.
Yeah, well, it started with things like the Canterbury Tales, like by Geoffrey Chaucer. He taught that it's not just about writing. That's why I don't always like to use the word writer. It's more of a storyteller. He got people to travel. Well, obviously, he told the stories of the travellers to the Canterbury Cathedral. And it was all spoken word, and that is how literature came to be, because, of course, if you sit round and you gossip with your friends and tell stories, you are just passing on what people have done for centuries. I don't know when it started, but I just think it's part of human nature.
Yeah,
it's there
very
forever.
human. Yeah, very human.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for coming on the show, Alexa.
Thank you for having me.
Well, that concludes this week's episode of the My Generation podcast. We are coming so close to the 1 year anniversary of the show. Thank you all so much for listening. It's been great to start featuring more musicians on the show, having Sammy come on with his musical piece and expand the show and see it grow over the last year of My Generation podcast content, and being able to bring it to you here from the county of Kent or wherever you're listening from, because this podcast, despite being a very Kent-based show, is universal. You can listen from anywhere.
Just like literature.
Thank you very much for coming on the show, Alexa.
Thank you.
That concludes this week's episode. We have got... Who have we got coming up next? Off Topic are coming up next, and we've got Dan Inwood back to celebrate the 1 year anniversary of the My Generation podcast. But we'll see you next week for the next episode of the My Generation podcast.